September 5, 1944. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stepped through the doors of his old headquarters in the West for the first time in 2 months, and the building felt less like a command post than a mausoleum. In July, he had been pushed out for telling Hitler's staff what no one in Berlin wanted to hear: that Normandy was lost, that the front in France was bleeding out, that Germany should seek peace while there was still something left to bargain with. Now Hitler had summoned him back, and that alone was proof of how deep the crisis had become. Dictators did not recall dismissed commanders for comfort. They recalled them when the system was cracking, and there was no one else left to blame. General Gunther Blumrit, the chief of staff for the German forces in the West, was waiting with maps laid across a table. The paper didn't just show a retreat. It showed a collapse. 6 weeks earlier, the Allies had burst out of Normandy. Now they were racing across France at a speed that felt impossible even to the men watching it happen. Most of France was gone. The Americans and British were surging toward Germany's frontier. Blumenritt's finger moved to the southern sector and stopped on the spearhead that mattered most: George Patton's Third Army. In 3 weeks, Patton had ripped across hundreds of miles, and his forward elements sat roughly 100 miles from the German border, with nothing substantial between them and the Rhine. Rundstedt stared at that empty space on the map the way a man stares at an open door in the middle of a burning house. Then he asked the question whose answer he already suspected because the map had already answered it. What do we have to stop him with? Blumenritt didn't dress it up. Nothing. The German situation in the first days of September 1944 was worse than most people can easily picture. This wasn't an orderly withdrawal to prepared positions. It wasn't a defensive plan unfolding with grim efficiency. It was the near-total disintegration of German military power in Western Europe. The kind of failure that cracks an officer corps from the inside because it violates everything that corps believes about itself. Rundstedt and Blumrit were looking at a front where the units that had fought in France were dead, scattered, or fleeing east in disorder. Heavy equipment had been abandoned. Vehicles were blown by their own crews because fuel was gone. Columns that had once moved under tight control now moved like a tide of panic, each man thinking only about getting away. The famous West Wall, the Siegfried Line, still existed as concrete and steel, but it had been stripped for the Eastern Front long before. The bunkers remained, yes, but as hollow shells. Concrete without men is not a fortress. A pillbox without ammunition is just a tomb waiting to be occupied by whoever arrives first. To understand what it felt like inside German headquarters, you have to see the roads as they actually were. Not the neat arrows and symbols on a map, but the choking reality. Officers described burned trucks blocking intersections, horse-drawn wagons overturned in ditches, soldiers tossing rifles aside because carrying a weapon slowed their run. Units losing radio contact, losing orders, losing identity. In place of discipline, there was only the primal urge to get across the Rhine before the Americans reached it. For an officer class raised on the myth of German order, the humiliation cut deeper than defeat. This was the nightmare, not simply being beaten, but being unmade. After the war, German commanders were unusually candid about just how weak they had been in those early September days. American Army historians questioned them at length, and the testimony that survived is striking not for excuses, but for blunt detail. General Siegfried Westphal, who served as an operations officer at Obe West, later estimated that around the first days of September, the entire Western Front possessed the effective combat strength of perhaps 10 to 12 divisions. To someone who doesn't live inside military numbers, that might sound like a formidable force, but the number was a mirage. A German division on paper was supposed to hold around 17,000 men. These were not paper divisions. Most were battered remnants. 2,000 to 5,000 men, sometimes less, short of ammunition, short of fuel, short of heavy weapons. Many lacked reliable artillery. Many were missing transport. Against them, Patton alone had roughly a dozen divisions, many near full strength, well supplied compared to the enemy, and backed by complete Allied air superiority. Even if Germany's Western divisions had been healthy and positioned perfectly, they would have been outmatched. They were not healthy. They were not positioned perfectly. They were barely positioned at all. The most critical weakness was reserves. In military terms, reserves are what keep a front from snapping. They are what you commit to seal a breach, to stop a breakthrough, to restore a line after a shock. In early September 1944, Germany effectively had no meaningful reserves in the West. Blumenritt later stated that there were no panzer divisions available for immediate deployment anywhere between the Channel and the Swiss border. The armored units that had fought in Normandy had been destroyed or were being rebuilt far back inside Germany. The few formations still technically assigned to the West were shadows. 20% strength still forming, not ready. And without armored reserves, stopping an armored thrust becomes almost impossible. Infantry can dig in. Yes, infantry can delay. But infantry cannot reliably hunt down fast-moving tank columns, cannot cut them apart, cannot deliver the kind of counterpunch that ends a breakthrough before it becomes a catastrophe. To stop Patton's kind of warfare, you needed panzers. There were none. Westphal and others like him were later uncomfortably direct about the conclusion that followed. Germany had no reserves, no properly manned fortifications, and no prepared positions. If Patton had been able to keep his tempo in those early September days, they believed he could have reached the Rhine quickly and possibly crossed it, because there was no coherent defensive system capable of absorbing that shock. German intelligence, even in chaos, remained sharp at one thing: tracking Allied movement. They knew where Patton was. They watched the radio traffic. They saw the speed of his spearheads, the direction of his pushes, the pattern of his raids. They also knew something else. Patton's fuel situation was tightening. That knowledge was a thin thread to hold on to. But in desperation, you cling to thin things. Then something happened that the German command could not understand. At first, Patton's advance slowed, then faltered, then almost stopped. The Third Army that had been covering 30 to 40 meters a day was suddenly sitting by roadsides or inching forward in short, cautious movements. German intelligence officers monitoring American radio traffic reported severe fuel shortages. Tanks were immobilized. Combat operations were being curtailed. Units were consolidating positions instead of racing into the open space ahead. At the beginning, some German officers suspected deception. Patton was aggressive. Patton was theatrical. Patton was known for misdirection and sudden thrusts. Perhaps the talk of fuel shortages was a trick, a way to lure German forces into premature counterattacks. But as day followed day and the Third Army remained largely stationary, the impossible truth became undeniable. It wasn't deception, it was logistics. Patton wasn't being stopped by German resistance. He was being stopped by empty fuel tanks. Inside Rundstedt's headquarters, the relief was not subtle. It moved through the staff like a physical sensation, as if a weight that had been crushing their chests was lifted just enough to allow breathing again. But relief was mixed with a kind of disbelief because the battlefield logic made no sense. The front had not stabilized because Germany had done something brilliant. It had stabilized because the Americans had run out of gasoline at the moment when Germany was most vulnerable. For the American tankers, that pause must have felt surreal. For weeks, their world had been sound in motion. Engines, tracks, dust, the constant adrenaline of a chase in which the enemy seemed to dissolve before them. Then suddenly, the noise fell away. Thousands of men sat beside roads in the late summer sun, staring at maps that showed open country ahead, open routes, empty space where the enemy should have been. They could feel almost in their bones that German resistance was broken. The door was open, the corridor was clear, but the gauges were empty. The silence wasn't peace. It was heavy. It was the feeling of a winning ticket slipping from your fingers, while everyone around you pretends it hasn't fallen. After the war, German commanders described this pause in extraordinary language. They spoke of it the way men speak of a miracle. Not a religious miracle, but an event so beneficial and so inexplicable in military terms that it felt like providence. These were not romantic minds. These were professional officers trained to search for rational causes. Yet they struggled to find one. Runstead later wrote that the halt of Patton's Third Army in early September was inexplicable from a military standpoint. Patton had the strength, the position, the momentum. That he did not reach the Rhine then felt like a gift Germany did not deserve. Blumenritt, questioned by American officers, was even more direct. When Patton stopped, German commanders could not understand why the Americans had stopped themselves at the moment Germany was most exposed and least able to resist. The phrase that echoes through German post-war recollection is striking. The miracle in the West. A term that deliberately reminded them of earlier moments in German history when collapse had been unexpectedly delayed. But this time the miracle was not a new weapon or a brilliant maneuver. It was a pause. The German command did not waste a reprieve. Between the first days of September and the end of November 1944, they rebuilt their western defenses at a speed that alarmed Allied intelligence watching it unfold. The first priority was the West Wall. Units that had been retreating in disorder were reorganized, re-equipped as best as possible, and sent into the bunkers. Training battalions were rushed forward. Luftwaffe ground personnel and sailors were formed into emergency infantry formations. Men who had never expected to hold a rifle in a trench were now holding one because there was nothing else. By late September, the West Wall had shifted from empty concrete to a real defensive position. Imperfect, uneven, often manned by exhausted troops, but real enough to slow an attacker and bleed him. The second priority was armor. Germany's tank production in late 1944 remained surprisingly high given the bomb damage and chaos. But producing tanks and using them effectively are two different problems. In the first weeks after Normandy, the issue was not only numbers, it was time. Time to move vehicles to the front. Time to gather crews. Time to rebuild shattered formations into units that could fight as units again. The pause gave Germany that time. By November, several armored divisions that had been mauled in Normandy had been reconstituted to fighting strength and placed where they could be used either to defend or to strike. German record-keeping, even in defeat, remained meticulous, and post-war analysis of orders of battle makes clear how the West was reinforced. During September and into October, divisions were transferred from wherever they could be found, from the Eastern Front, from occupation duties in the North, from training areas inside Germany, and pushed west. Some were Panzer or Panzer Grenadier divisions with meaningful armor. Many were not elite, but they were intact. Alongside them came newly formed Volksgrenadier divisions, lower quality formations built from older men, young recruits, and recovered wounded. They were not designed for grand mobile warfare, but they could man trenches, operate artillery, and hold a bunker long enough to make an attacker pay. In early September, Germany had almost nothing coherent in the West. By November, they had assembled the equivalent of dozens of divisions, enough to stiffen the West Wall and create something like a reserve. And that time, those weeks had one consequence larger than all the rest. It made possible the Ardennes Offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge. That operation was not improvised. It required months of planning, stockpiling ammunition, gathering fuel, assembling armies, and building a deception plan strong enough to preserve surprise. General Hasso von Manufel, who commanded 5th Panzer Army in the Ardennes later, testified that the operation would have been impossible if Patton had continued advancing in September. The troops needed for the attack would have been tied down defending the Rhine approaches. The fuel and ammunition would have been consumed in desperate defensive battles. The surprise would have been lost because Germany would have been fighting for its life on its own border. But because the front stabilized in September, Hitler's staff had time. They assembled armored units, gathered supplies, and identified a weak seam in the Allied line. When the attack came on December 16, 1944, it achieved shock. It drove a deep bulge into American positions, inflicted enormous casualties, and delayed the Allied advance for weeks. Whether one argues over exact numbers or precise timelines, the human cost was unquestionable. Men who might have lived if the German army had never had the chance to mount that gamble were buried instead under ardent snow. When Patton finally received enough fuel and supplies to resume broad offensive action later in September, the war he returned to was not the war he had left. The Germans were no longer a mob streaming east in open country. They were in prepared positions. Artillery was registered. Minefields were laid. The West Wall was manned. The same ground that had offered miles of opportunity now offered yards of suffering. Progress that had been measured in dozens of miles was now measured in hundreds of yards. Casualties rose. The weather turned. Air support so decisive in summer became unreliable under clouds and rain. There's a tragic poetry to that shift. During the pursuit across France, the skies were bright. It felt like liberation, like inevitability, like the war rushing toward its ending. Then when the supplies finally arrived and the offensive resumed against hardened defenses, the rains came. Gray skies, mud, cold. The optimism of August drained away. Men who might have ended the war in summer uniforms now shivered in foxholes, fighting for hedge and bunker lines. What should have been a continued pursuit became a grinding attrition campaign. German officers recognized the difference immediately. Once the West Wall was manned, Patton was still dangerous, but no longer unstoppable. Germany could withdraw deliberately, choose defensive positions, and force the Americans to attack prepared lines. In early September, none of that was possible. Germany was on the edge of collapse and was given the one gift that mattered more than any weapon: time. Patton crossed the Rhine on March 22, 1945, more than 6 months after he had first been within reach of it. The opportunity of September was gone, and Patton knew it. He later wrote that had his army reached the river in early autumn, German resistance might have cracked months earlier. German commanders agreed. Westphal, Rundstedt, Blumentritt, and others testified that in early September, Germany lacked the forces to stop Patton. The West Wall was unmanned. Reserves did not exist. Had the Third Army maintained its tempo, they believed it could have reached the Rhine by mid-September. American interrogators asked whether Germany could have stopped Patton without the fuel shortage, and whether the war might have ended sooner. The answers were consistent. The Western Front was near psychological and material collapse. An American entry into Germany in early autumn, combined with Soviet pressure from the east, could have triggered a crisis Berlin might not have survived. In that scenario, the Ardennes offensive would not have existed. German officers later stressed one lesson above all others: tempo. When an enemy is broken and retreating, pressure must be maintained. An army that stops gives its enemy the most precious gift in war: time. That time did not change the final outcome, but it changed who survived. The September halt was not just a strategic pause. It was a human tragedy, measured in lives lost during the months of fighting that followed.
Find stories like this as fascinating as I do, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Thanks for watching.